And next up we have the Guild Core Dragonborn, a dungeon core LitRPG Cultivation epic written by Tj Reynolds. It is 506 pages, $4.99. It's available on Kindle Limited, and here's the author's description. The hero dreamed of ascending. The monk craved redemption. The dungeon only wished to keep things tidy. Kai was the least likely young man to ascend. Raised on his uncle's potato farm, he began his career as an adventurer with empty pockets and a little skill. But a foolish attempt to prove his bravery leads Kai to unlock hidden power within himself and acquire a most unlikely ally. Rhona is a battle-scarred soldier who is as likely to toss a quip as she is to throw a punch. After setting aside a promising career in the army to pursue the path of the bleeding tiger, she sets out to stop a war and seek atonement for a bloody past. When Bancroft and the Earth Core Bancroft the Earth Core awakens, he can't wait to clean up his dungeon and begin building new things. A recovered item from his past reminds him that more is at stake, however, putting an end to such pleasantries. Join the Guild Core, a small band of friends determined to restore the world to an age of heroes, dungeons, dragons, and honor. And then there's a whole thing. I'm like, oh, this is like this, and this is a thing. So, full disclosure, I received a copy for review. I purchased a copy when it became available. This is a slice of life multi-narrative story set on a fantasy RPG world. I don't personally normally like multi-narrative stories, but this one was done well. I really actually enjoyed it. And that's mostly because the two of the narratives are the main character, Kai, a half-dragon teen, and the dungeon core itself, and they're basically together for most of the time, and they do the dungeon core thing, or they do the adventuring thing. And the other narrative, which is is Rhona, the monk, which I'm on a second, her story was so entertaining by itself that I didn't mind that it was a different perspective, and then it wasn't connected to the main character story until like much later into the novel. But it did such a good job of like adding world building and character development and backstory that I really just liked it a lot on its own. The main character, Kai, is the half-dragon teen who accidentally heals and bonds the dungeon core, and there's the dungeon core itself, who's sentient, but without most of his former powers or memories and there's less dungeon building and more adventuring. Third, the delusional former soldier Rhona, who has given up the way of the sword for the lost unarmed star and goes on a journey of self-discovery. The two narrators, Kai and the core, are fairly close together, coming in the same events. I just said all this, basically. The three narratives come together eventually, but for the most part, the former soldier Rhona kind of does her own thing, giving background to the world, building her character, doing the slice of life action story thing, and I really like that. I really did. I think I like this side character Rhona more than the main character, just because of such a great backstory that the character had. She had such emotional depth. That I was like, she had, it's not quite it's sort of a tragic backstory, but it's also a story of redemption and finding herself, and at the same time world building along the way without like giving an info dump. And she just has the best power set as a monk. Like seriously, I'm like, the dungeon course is fine. The main character is fine. Rhona's awesome. I'd absolutely read a solo adventure story of her just by herself. I thought she as a character, her backstory was better than the main character, which is not to say that that's bad at all. On the RPG side of things, it's a little bit custom. There are 3 levels to each rank and a small bit of cultivation to get to each rank. There's an essence instead of XP. You still see ability and spell descriptions with the essence cost and character sheet stats, levels, and classes. So there's some familiar things, but also just like a few custom sections. Instead of like levels going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's basically, I think, Crimson 1, 2, 3, and then it goes to the next level and it goes 1, 2, 3 of that, and then continues on. Things that I enjoyed in the story, probably the world building, the character background stuff and character development was probably the best done. The author really took his time to develop meaningful backgrounds for the characters, complex histories of the world, its races, its nations, and he did it in such a way that it didn't feel like it wasn't just like, oh, by the way, readers, here's the history of the world for 3 chapters. It's essentially from the main character's perspective and their different perspectives, as one being from 2 different nations who have a background of war and history. Also, Rhona's background as a soldier, giving her a unique perspective and wider view of recent world conflicts, and also just like the course perspective of somebody who existed like a couple thousand years ago and is like, oh, these nations weren't always like this, and giving a larger like global view of world characters, gods, experiences, world building in that sense. And that was done, that spread out just gradually through the story so that it's just entertaining information, but it also gives like a really fleshed out world and view of these characters. Things that left me, also already touched on this. Combat was good, had great visceral fights, characters being challenged, so good on there. The general adventures, well thought out, very entertaining. Rhona, again, my favorite character, favorite class, favorite setting, favorite background character, or for background for that character. Things that left me wanting. These might be things for the readers to be aware of when they're purchasing, just to set their expectations appropriately, because I can absolutely see some readers giving us a negative review just because in the original novel description, or in the novel title, it says this is a dungeon core story. It also says this is a cultivation epic story. And the author has mentioned to me, written in, saying that he plans to kind of modify that based upon the review from the podcast and other feedback from readers. But from the version that I got, I have to mention that there's not really a lot of traditional dungeon core stuff here. And by that I mean making dungeons, making monsters, making traps, and having people come through and try to kill them. That to me, when I read dungeon core, that's what I think of. In general, I think of it at my dungeon. I think of the Slime Dungeon Chronicles and a bunch of other dungeon core stories. That's what a dungeon core story does. And in this, there is some of that. It's about 10% towards the end. But most of the story is not that kind of story. The dungeon does some of those things. He does sort of build up a dungeon. He does sort of divine monsters. But there's not really much of the adventures coming in and dungeon diving. That's not the focus of the story for sure. Instead, the story focuses on as the dungeon core as a character itself who goes adventuring with his friend. And that's kind of his place in the story as not as the main character, but as a secondary character, helping the main character power up, become powerful, and also giving him goals for the book and the series. But there's not a lot of, I'm building a dungeon to kill a bunch of adventurers coming in so that I become super powerful. The author wrote and said he does plan to develop that more in book number 2, so that's something to look for in this series, but there's not a lot of it in book 1. Also, cultivation, minimal aspect. Like, it really came down to every time the main character would hit a new rank, he'd get instruction about messing with his core. He'd follow those instructions, and that was it. That's the extent of the cultivation in this story. There's nothing to it. He's not meditating to gather ether or essence. There's no improvement to like his body or mind or his spirit. There's no hardening or like replacing his blood with like more efficient blood or like purging his body of impurities or anything like that. The stuff that most people who see cultivation would probably recognize as being expected tropes. To me, the cultivation stuff in general was kind of skippable. If it was taken on the story, this story would be exactly the same. There's really, so that it's kind of a light element here, but it does exist. It's just not the kind of cultivation that I would have expected if it was in the novel description or if it's in the novel title itself. So just be aware. I'm mentioning it just so you can have a reasonable expectation of what those elements exist in this particular story. Overall, though, I had a good time with this. I really did. I enjoyed the depth of characters and the world building, the fights, the slice level adventuring. Again, I expected more or something different from the dungeon core and cultivation aspects, but once I understood what the story was going to be, I just rolled with it and I had a good time with it. Me gets a score of a 7.6 out of 10. That's slightly above like average for the good side of things. A couple points taken out just because of those issues with the cultivation and dungeon core aspects, but again, entertaining story. I had a good time with it. That's the dungeon core book number 1 of the dungeon core 1 Dragonborn dungeon core LitRPG epic. Cultivation epic with a score of 7.6 out of 10.